Now I hand you over to Dr. Firoza J. Godrej, the chairperson of the Museum Society of Mumbai, to introduce the speaker for today as well as the topic. Dr. Firoza, screen is
Thank
all
you,
yours.
Jason. Thank you very, very much for that introduction and putting all our housekeeping remarks in place. Firstly, let me welcome especially our speaker for this evening, Dr. Lakshmi Subramanian. Thank you for acceding to our request on behalf of Godrej Archives, the CSMVS Museum, and the Museum Society of Bombay. Thank you so much for joining us. I know you're tucked away in a small village in South Goa, but to have you with us is really a great honor. And we are all looking forward to hearing about business in the time of contagion. A few words about this lecture. It's a historical perspective that we will be witnessing today. And this presentation is an attempt to explain contagion more broadly and to investigate the narratives it generates. These are important for all stakeholders, including business and enterprise, that draws a lot of strength and substance from trust, reciprocity, and confidence, that in turn enables a better management of risk and liabilities. Just how contagion played out in past moments of history and what the present scenario holds out will be the issues that the presentation will briefly touch upon. It argues that narrative production is a key strategy that is deployed to make sense of the unknown, as well as to manage as best as possible the limitations of public policy and intervention. It also argues that it becomes vital to maintain a robust public sphere that will enable the production and utilization of sensitive messaging and how within it, business has a key role to play. I have known Dr. Subramanian almost for the last decade, and our paths crossed with each other when I was working on an exhibition, and in 2012, she had released one of her books, The Three Parsis. Of course, she has many, many more publications to her credit, including one on Gandhi, which was released as recently as 2020. Dr. Subramanian is currently Professor of History at BITS Pilani, Goa, an associate member of the Institute of Advanced Studies, Nantes, in France. She is currently a scholar in residence at the Godrej Archives and has a long and distinguished career teaching and researching with a string of books and essays to her credit. She is well known for her expertise in Indian maritime history, and we're looking forward to a talk by Dr. Lakshmi on that subject, maybe sometime in the next quarter of next year, and on business groups, and in the field of social and cultural history of modern India. As I said, she has several publications to her credit, books on history, maritime history, on music as well. So with these few words, I do not wish to stand between all of you, our audience. Thank you so much for joining us this evening. And I now hand you over to Chief Archivist at Godrej Archives, Vrinda Patare, to take over from me. Do enjoy the evening and do join us in our forthcoming events. Thank you so much, Dr. Lakshmi, on behalf of all of us. Thank you.
Thank you, Dr. Firoza Godrej. Collaborating with the Museum Society of Mumbai and CSMVS is always a pleasure. But let me quickly inform you about the Godrej Archives before we proceed. Conceived in 1997 and formally started in 2006, Godrej Archives is a corporate archive preserving the history of 123 years old Godrej Group of companies. We archive histories of its products, manufacturing plants, and people, and making it available for research. Apart from preserving the collection for future, Godrej Archives also strives to communicate this history through exhibitions, publications, art installations, etc. We have also started the research fellowship since 2018 to encourage research in business history. Godrej Archives has also instituted an annual lecture series to make people appreciate the value of archives and popularize the subject of business history And since 2006, we have been collaborating with the Museum Society and the CSMVS in this endeavor, and we intend to plan this soon. But this lockdown made us explore new possibilities of engaging with our audience through online talks, and we are once again happy to collaborate with the Museum Society and the CSMVS for our Thursday talk series, as we call it. But when we were planning this talk series, I just happened to discuss about the pandemic and the unprecedented times that we are all experiencing with Dr. Lakshmi Subramanian, who is also the scholar in residence, as Dr. Godrej had just now told you, at Godrej Archives, and where she is trying to discover the social lives of three objects. And these three products are chair, steel cupboard, and refrigerator. But we will talk about that later when we will plan the talk around that. But coming back to the pandemic, while discussing the way the pandemic has impacted us and the economy and the business, Dr. Lakshmi Subramaniam during our conversation offered really interesting insights by drawing parallel to the earlier catastrophic events such as these. And that's when I just casually asked her if she can share these insights with our audience as well. And to our pleasure, she agreed instantly. So thank you for that, Dr. Subramaniam. So now let me not stand between you and Lakshmi. So I would now hand over to Dr. Lakshmi Subramaniam.
Thank you, Vrinda. I expect Jason to be taking over housekeeping issues. Since, as Firoza said, I live in recording that I just did and sent it on, and perhaps that can will of course be available for questions. All of you. Let me first thank my organizers, Godrej Archives, and especially Vrinda, who has been instrumental in, in having me say yes to the idea of the talk. To share with you some ideas that I've been more recently thinking about in relation to business and crisis of all kinds. I also want to place on record my acknowledgement to the writing seminar that I organized in BITS Pilani Goa, structured around the theme of contagion, and where interaction with students was really productive and helped us, I think, all of us to think through contagion and the extraordinary narratives that contagion has actually produced in the last 9 months. I'd like to start this talk by setting off a few caveats in place. Many of you probably are aware that my understanding and research in business practices has been rooted more in the historical past than in the present. I'm more comfortable working with the 18th and 19th century rather than in the contemporary moment that I find myself in. And this is for two reasons. A, I'm still developing my expertise, but B, and I think this is more important, as a practitioner of history, I'm always a little uncomfortable drawing insights from an archive that is in many ways in the making. And when you do not have the necessary objective distance between what you experience and what has been represented and what is written about. And because the objective distance is not really present between the phenomena and its representation, I'm always a little uncomfortable about saying anything with any degree of certitude. However, I'm also responding to the realization conceptually and experientially that contagion as a phenomena, and I'm thinking of contagion not just as an epidemiological phenomena, but as a deep social one, has always had a story to tell and is a narrative in itself, and that generates narratives, thus constantly yielding an expanding repertoire of facts, fiction, interpretation, and analysis. So, given this, there is a pressure, I think, on all of us to make sense of the unprecedented times we live in, to try and make meaning of the crisis that we find ourselves in, and to reckon with the fact that it is a time, or it is not a time, but business can be as usual. Business cannot be as usual, and business, any business, all business, is forced to adapt to the rhythm of the disease of the narrative that the disease has thrown up, its duration, and its containment. At the outset, let me start by suggesting that I'm not looking at any particular sector of business or at a specific industry or drawing up a balance sheet of losses and liabilities during 2020, the year of the pandemic. I'm instead reflecting on what contagion does to the basic principles that animate our social existence: trust, social reciprocity, on which all business rests, and yet also forcing me to consider what it is about uncertainty that fuels what observers call the animal spirit of business. So there is trust and reciprocity on the one hand, which is crucial to any kind of business activity, any kind of social activity indeed, but there's also the very reality of trust, of uncertainty, of risk-taking that seems to be so important for successful business. So how do these two things square up, particularly at a time when the disease and when representation of the disease seems to have a life of its own? Logically, we know that business and entrepreneurship is organized to deal with risk-taking, to deal with uncertainty, in order to make that leap of faith to a higher level of productivity and profit realization. And yet, there is this massive outbreak of uncertainty which business is being forced to deal with and cannot be oblivious to. So how does one study this apparently contradictory phenomena? Do we have any examples from the past? Are these illustrations from the past completely anachronistic and unrealistic? Or is there something valuable in recalling those historical examples and thereby revisiting issues of trust and reciprocity, issues of what is represented and what is not, and what kind of stories that were told of the past? How do we insert those older stories within the larger narrative of contagion today? That follows always a very formulaic storyline, replete with conventions of finding the origins, its pathways of transmission, of stigmatizing certain people, certain communities, certain groups, and of representing the virus as a malignant entity that is designed to end the world, thereby making it hyper-visible. How do we think about the stories on contagion then and now? And do we have to really look at these stories carefully? Because what is the ulterior rationale behind these stories? Unless we can look at the narratives more carefully, unless we can halt the narrative or punctuate it, there is really no hope of restoring, I feel, a degree of cautious optimism and of faith in a social contract that is ultimately so crucial for good, robust business. My first subsection is looking back, history's lessons, ? Can we look at history for lessons is the question that I start with. To look for historical lessons is not always easy. And while taking a longue durée approach to the relationship between business and contagion, in the case of Western India, to the bubonic plague and the influenza epidemic that India suffered from almost exactly a century ago, and which actually wiped off an enormous swathe of the population across the subcontinent. When we look at this, we also have to confront the fact that the influenza epidemic in particular did not yield a rich historiographical harvest. Thus, the impact of the epidemic was no doubt devastating. According to David Arnold, an important historian of epidemics, the 1918-19 influenza epidemic in India cost at least 12 million lives, more than in any other country, caused widespread damage to the economy, to infrastructure, and yet, unlike our present experience today, it did not generate the same, or apparently did not generate the same narrativization, and very quickly became a forgotten pandemic. So we don't really remember the influenza pandemic as deeply and densely as we could have. Very little was recorded visually or textually, and historians have tried to explain this lacuna. And most of them have suggested that while India was exposed to influenza as a global event, the effects of its involvement in the Great War, the influenza episode in India was somehow inflected by local events and processes, and therefore its telling followed a very unusual trajectory. Thus, the impact of the disease was somehow overshadowed by the prior encounter that Western India had with bubonic plague, by military recruitment, the war, by food shortages, by price rise that pushed India to the brink of famine. So somehow this particular influenza epidemic did not sort of generate or was not foregrounded quite in the same manner, and sort of got subsumed within a larger narrative of political unrest, economic discontent, leaving little trace of the epidemic or of its impact on society and economy. My intention is not to contest this, but to merely suggest that it might not be, after all, a case of underrepresentation alone, but it might be a case of a very alternative narrative strategy that had its own logic and rationale, in which stakeholders participated almost subconsciously, making it a forgotten pandemic, but not actually combating it with the kind of proactive energy that it required. Following Priscilla Wall's conceptual framework of the outbreak narrative in a brilliant book on contagious cultures, I would therefore surmise, and this is my argument, that like all outbreak narratives in the past and in the present, the influenza epidemic too threw up its formulaic conventions and subplots. And it perhaps remains for us to go back and excavate those traces and conventions and study them in context. So we might in fact find that the so-called under-narrative argument may in fact be a red herring. It's only when we go back and parse what little narratives that the influenza epidemic left behind that we could perhaps consider how government, the colonial government in that case, business, Indian business, emerged as stakeholders in the production of the outbreak narrative, and in fact molded it in a particular way that certainly had larger implications for looking at contagion, not merely as an epidemiological phenomena, but as a social one. And this is very important then, and this is very important now, because I think looking at contagion carefully has implications for business then as it has now. A lot of what I therefore now say is more of a hunch. It's like a kind of, tentative hypothesis that I'm playing with. And I want to say, therefore, that there is a way in which the epidemic story in Bombay was framed. There is a way in which the epidemic narrative in Bombay deployed certain narratives and deployed certain tropes and certain conventions that were clear in the official reports that we have, that are clear in the reports that we have of the government extolling the business communities, the reports that we have about civil society coming forward to help the community. And these narratives actually are very important, because these narratives are not just important because they tell you what the business community or what civil society did, which it certainly does tell you, but I think they also happen to be important elements in the production of a larger narrative that then makes contagion a social phenomenon. And it's not just about disease. It goes far beyond disease, goes far beyond causes of disease, goes far beyond medical diagnosis, but it actually touches upon sections or issues of social and sociological relevance that therefore makes contagion much more than an epidemiological phenomenon. We could certainly find parallels in today's situation, even when there are important divergences, as several prominent stakeholders, including business personalities, come forward in informing public policy decisions about planned unlockdowns and in bringing back the economy on its rails. It might therefore be a fruitful exercise, I suggest, to reflect closely on how contagion then and how contagion now has generated a narrative that foregrounds business priorities in a time of unprecedented crisis. My next section is representing the epidemic and responding to its fallout. Like all contagion, the influenza epidemic too followed a formulaic plotline of origins, conditions for incubation, pathways of transmission, and the need for containment. The virus was projected as virulent and capable of rapid spread with an enormous potential for creating damage, indeed of apocalyptic proportions. Medical reports of Europeans and Indians alike spoke of the rapidity of the spread of the virus, the number of its victims, its total fatalities reaching a virulence before which even plague, the dreaded plague, kind of receded into insignificance. From Bombay, Punjab, central provinces, horror stories poured in, emphasizing the vulnerability of the human species to the attack from the virus. F.G. and Stokes wrote as incomparably the most violent outbreak of disease of which we have any knowledge. The ravages of the disease were seen at their worst. Stokes wrote, in the villages where the complete helplessness of the people, combined with scarcity of food and clothing, produced a calamity which baffles description. The Sanitary Commissioner of the Punjab painted an equally grim picture, this time around of the pathetic infrastructure that rendered it impossible to confront the disease. The hospitals were choked so that it was impossible to remove the dead quickly enough to make room for the dying. The streets and lanes of the cities were littered with dead and dying people. The postal and telegraph services were completely disorganized. The train service continued, but at all the principal stations, dead and dying were being removed from the trains. The burning ghats and burial grounds were literally swamped with corpses, while an even greater number awaited removal. The depleted medical service, itself sorely stricken by the epidemic, was incapable of dealing with more than a minute fraction of the sickness requiring attention and immediate priority. Nearly every household was lamenting a death, and everywhere terror and confusion reigned. So far, so good. Commissioners, medical representatives, were all referring to the tremendous or the terrible ravages that the disease had in fact exposed. But there was also, in a way, a kind of silence about the apathy of the government and the larger establishment to confront the inadequacy of public health. So what we find is that the reports stopped short and did not generate the kind of action from the colonial government that remained completely indifferent to either medical intervention or to the overhauling of the public health infrastructure. Instead, what was reiterated time and again was that the peculiar conditions in India, especially Bombay, that made it especially hospitable to the virus. So, I'm not suggesting that medical commissioners and sanitary inspectors and health commissioners were arguing that the disease was indigenous, or that the disease did not have larger origins in global pathways of transmission, but there was a way in which it was reported that somehow made India and India's poor particularly hospitable incubators. So there's a way in which the narrative foregrounds the specificity of India, the specificity of India's poor in the virulence of the disease, which of course is magnified beyond all description. So this is important, the trope of the disease being malignant, and in which there are certain aspects of human action that play a part, is completely, it is in contrast to the complete lack of regard or concern about existing available infrastructure. So in Dr. Turner's graphic words, Bombay during the month of June may be compared to a huge incubator with suitable material already prepared for the insemination of germs of disease. The temperature, moisture, material in suitable conditions. An overcrowded city with large working class population living in conditions which lend themselves to the rapid spread of disease, either insect-borne or from personal contact, should be introduced. Now, as I said, this is not to say that the colonial administration or medical establishment was saying that the epidemic was indigenous to India. There was no doubt it had traveled along ports and sea channels, and the global dimensions of the pandemic were never lost. But in the narrative that was produced, it was the local peculiarities that was always played up. It's interesting to note that in the early stages, the local situation also made it impossible for them to think about quarantines or even improving existing facilities. Thus, a constant and a recurrent motive in the representation of the epidemic and its social fallout was the praise showered on civil society. Notables in business who came forward to help the city just when the state government retreated. So the state government was very happy to talk about the inhospitable conditions, the squalor, the squalid conditions of the poor, the resistance of the poor to sort of listening to any advice, and the countervailing sort of recurrent motive was the enormous praise and appreciation showered on business communities who came forward to help. And I'm not saying here that the business communities or middle-class civil society did not intervene. Communities distribute food and medicine. And in Bombay, you had a number of organizations that did yeoman's work, and I'm thinking of Mridula and came forward with sort of condescending reports saying that never perhaps in the history of India did the educated and the fortunately placed members of the establishment, the business community, come forward to help in large numbers to help their poorer brethren on the fact that finally, the disease had helped middle-class Indians and particularly business groups to mobilize, and this kind of mobilization was seen as a political lesson that the colonial state in its apathy seemed to promote. So history, it was declared by the Sanitary Commissioner of Bombay, has shown that the loss of life through epidemic has actually become an important factor in awakening a public health conscience among educated Indians and businessmen. The appalling mortality of 1918 would not have been in vain if it inculcates in the minds of the general public the dire necessity for public health reform and for taxation to meet essential expenditure. What do we make of these kinds of reports? What does such an outbreak narrative and its course actually suggest? For long, historians have correctly surmised that one of the many reasons for the eclipse of the influenza casualties was the long-term spiral of India's famine-related death and malnutrition, the preoccupation with the wars, and the national movement. However, the outbreak narrative, as it unfolded, I think, warrants a closer attention. And because, if we are to make sense of how business and civil society actually responded to contagion, and of the way we are responding to contagion now, the contexts are very different. We have an independent state in power, and yet there are similarities. Part of the similarity lies or is to do with the undeniable fact that in most societies and most times, contagion is rarely only a medical phenomenon, and that social aspects of contagion surface in unusual ways, exposing deep fault lines and fissures, all of which are reproduced endlessly by media, market, and the state. Excuse me. Much of the emerging colonial discourse on disease and epidemic, plague or influenza, raised the bogey of the poor as carriers of disease. There's a strong similarity here. The colonial state developed the idea of the culture of poverty, which allowed them to accuse the poorer sections of the population for the problems of ill health and disease. Simultaneously, it spoke of the efforts, as I've just said, of the efforts of middle class and business elites to emerge as major philanthropists who happen to work in close union with voluntary agencies. And I'm thinking of Bombay Sanitary Association, the Social Service League, the Anti-Tuberculosis League to deal with the crisis. However, being a historian who would like to read both along and against the grain, and if I were to read this cynically, I could also suggest that these acts of public welfare and intervention were not value neutral, and that these were also to regulate the lives of workers lest they went on endless hartal and strikes. In terms of actual material provisions, social service leagues were set up. for workers, particularly for the Tata Mills and the Karim Bhoi group, and this definitely was an important step in the evolution of labour policy. But it needs to be kept in mind that mortality rates were disproportionately high among the poor and the labouring poor, even as industry did extraordinarily well in the interwar years, as we know. We also know that the entire Ahmedabad mill strike was also on the basis of the plague bonus that Gandhi then tried to negotiate. So, I'm saying, following the work of Priyanka Srivastav, that plague outbreaks, epidemics of influenza, actually produced a discourse on workers' well-being and in fact reinserted the connection between poverty, uncleanliness and disease. Reports by individual leaders, as well as by the Royal Commission on Labour in India, emphasized the squalid conditions of working class residences and the general lack of vigour among the city's working class and poor. Without suggesting that these were imagined conditions, and I'm not saying they were constructed facts, I'm just suggesting that narratives on contagion have an enormous traction to perpetuate conditions of inequity and stigmatize sections of the population that in the long run are not conducive to business. Public health remained woefully neglected then as now. Very few decisive steps were taken to ameliorate living conditions for labour, and the much-needed compact between state, business and labour was not realised. Thus, I argue that the understudied influenza epidemic and its impact on business and labour program could be profitably analysed through the optics of the outbreak narrative that may help us question the assumptions about the epidemic and the amnesia of it that followed. That brings me to my final section, the history of the present, COVID-19 and India. The fact that we live amidst unprecedented conditions of uncertainty make it difficult to estimate the scale of damage that the pandemic has produced in our social and socio-economic lives. And yet we cannot be impervious to the nature of the messaging that we have heard, to the ways in which myth and science have been braided to create a particular mode of understanding the virus, how a narrative of stigmatization and scapegoating has come to prevail, and warlike metaphors and spectacularization of phenomena has come to inform the way in which we look at the situation. The creating of others, minority communities and migrant labor, both favored scapegoats, as willful defaulters and subsequently demonizing them was an obvious strategy in the first months of the pandemic and utilized by the government to bail itself out during a period when it was clueless to confront the problems of a non-existent public health infrastructure in several states of the Union. Bihar was an obvious one. When messaging was mixed, communication was inconsistent, intervention measures were hopelessly lacking, leaving millions of migrant workers traumatized and left to fend for themselves. It was here that the ruling establishment reiterated the social dimensions of contagion, no longer just a disease, but in every respect a social disease, something it could fully capitalize on to play to the fears and myths of the consuming citizenry. What came out to play was a formulaic, spectacular plotline, identifying an emerging infection, tracking its pathways of dissemination, chronicling scientific research to contain the disease, and thus develop and amplify an outbreak narrative that often hampered the more pressing task of social healing and restoration of trust. In the initial stages, when the government imposed a severe lockdown without any prior preparation or warning, the narrative was a hodgepodge of quasi-scientific phenomena, pronouncements of allegations against groups and communities that were faulted for improper behavior, of invoking traditional myth and remedy against the infection, and of staging political brownie points against those states where the opposition was in power. The consequences were disastrous, but spectacular, providing endless media space for speculation and infotainment that served the sinister purpose of keeping the citizenry in hostage, confused and frightened. Meanwhile, there were endless programs on scientific opinions and their review by interested parties across the political spectrum, some adhering to herd immunity and to demands for removing lockdown, others warning the government of runaway rates of infection and spikes, and of keeping the lockdown measures more or less intact. On paper, the government insisted that the time had been profitably used to ramp up testing facilities and hospital services. On the ground, if anecdotal evidence is to be believed, the government remained clueless and mired in bureaucratic tangles. Some states, apparently and evidently, did better than others, producing additional narratives of containment and contagion, most of which revealed fault lines of community and class. The state of the vulnerable remained as abject as ever, with very few publicists coming forward as spokespersons to tackle critical issues of law, labor, and protection. Under these conditions, what must the role of business be? What kind of role can it assume? There is no doubt that business by default has to exist within a trust of culture, reciprocity, and support, of larger society of workers and consumers, of governments and the public. And therefore, it behoves on business to come out and make a stand. And they have to an extent. There were influential leaders like Rahul Bajaj or Kiran Mazumdar Shah who intervened in the debate on lives versus livelihoods very strongly and came out actively, proactively on concerted national and international action to combat the crisis and change the narrative on borders and immunized communities. Inside the House of Tata, there was an imaginative reconstruction of business and sort of reiterating the commitment to values of integrity, simplicity, but also innovation and social responsibility. This was a time to support innovation, Ratan Tata mentioned in his speech, and not dismiss some invention as somehow being outlandish and far out, but something we have to constantly look at. The House of Godrej too has expressed sentiments of faith and resilience in their own operations and earmarked a number of initiatives for support and relief, stepped up their products in relation to refrigeration, so important for vaccination. These have been important interventions, but maybe not entirely adequate, given the enormity of the crisis we all face. On the other hand, and this is where I stand, if India is true to form, an Indian business that has, from experience, drawn on, remarkable strategies of resilience. It has drawn from experiences of scarcity. We can think about the kind of crises that it has faced over the 65 years of the Republic and have had maneuvered very complex challenges to carve for itself an important role. I'm sure that it can now come forward with a more proactive program of fair and ecological and environment-friendly initiatives, and can in fact think about addressing larger implications of contagion, not just think about it as a blip for the moment that can be magically waved away by the wand of a vaccination, but somehow to try and help dissolve what I call social morbidities that the epidemic has reinforced. We've heard about comorbidities constantly, but what about the social comorbidities that the population faces? It is here, I think, that business has to come up with an alternative narrative that can refocus on the asymmetries of power and economic resources, reconceptualize development, that is to think more responsibly about social and ecological redistribution and on universal healthcare. Unless we have a sensitive story in place and we say it well, I'm not certain at all that we or the world would have learnt any lesson from this pandemic. To step back and tease out the raison d'etre of any dominant narrative that we hold sacred is probably the crucial need of the moment, and we can only hope that significant stakeholders like business will show us the way. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Lakshmi, for this wonderful lecture. And I just realized that when we usually talk about the period between the early 19th century to the early 20th century, we mostly talk about, industrial revolution or maybe imperialism. But somehow, as you have said, that we have forgotten about the pandemics, and that history and that narrative somewhere, I think, goes missing in the historical narrative that we are exposed to. And one really, I think, needs to study the scale of devastation that was caused by such catastrophic pandemics, a century back, and the resilience with which the society or business might have responded to pandemics would have actually would have been really a great learning for us. But as we had not really like documented well enough, I think we were really not equipped even today to deal with such kind of a pandemic or such kind of a catastrophic event. And I'm sure, I think the audience will have questions. But before we start question answers, I would like to also inform the participants that you can type your questions in the chat box, and we will be also putting the link to the feedback, which also you can later on give us fill in and send us the feedback about the lecture. So if anyone has the question, please feel free to start. Yes.
Vrinda, yeah, I was just thinking, Vrinda, before we begin, I just wanted to respond to something you said. And this is largely in response to something I've just recently been reading and could not integrate in the talk that I prepared for yesterday. It was the recent book by Chinmay Tumbe on labor migration, where in fact, some of the stories are actually very evocatively told. And he also came up with a very interesting interview in a newspaper about lessons that we did not learn about the way in which we treated labor. So I did want to contextualize that before I actually took on some responses.
I think Chinmay is also in the audience, I think, whose book we are really waiting for, On the Age of Pandemic. So Chinmay, in case you have any comment or question, would you like to add in?
Hi, yeah, thanks for a wonderful talk. Can you hear me?
Yes, Chinmay, go ahead.
Yeah, so, as I was sitting, and this is the year even in which I've been doing a lot of research on pandemics. So I wanted to ask Lakshmi, I mean, she's written so much on the 19th century world, especially in Bombay. How are these merchants, especially in Bombay, I mean, really looking at both plague and influenza? Is there some sort of a lobby back then, you feel, which is trying to say, let's get on with business and let's not try and slow it down? Because that's a fundamental issue confronting every pandemic, is how much do we lock down and how much do we not? And this is well documented in the cholera quarantine debates of the 19th century in Europe. But one of the things I've also felt while researching is, how these businesses actually strategize. Did the cotton mill industry of Bombay, for instance, appeal to the government to close down or pursue activities and so on? Especially in the context, again, of migration, because a lot of this labor was trying to go back, and there was this tussle between mill workers, for example, or the mills trying to keep people back or not. So just a general, question on how you see this thing about businesses trying to actively support policies or go against the government. What's your reading, of that time?
Lakshmi ma'am, you can go ahead. You're unmuted.
Okay, you've unmuted me. Okay, thanks, Chinmay. That was a great question. See, my whole point is that while we have a clear set of responses by civil society to the plague, and that, is visible in the form of the City Improvement Trust and so on, you do not have the same response to the influenza epidemic, which sort of makes it a forgotten epidemic. So my concern was to break that cyst of amnesia open. So that was my larger concern. And I think the question you ask is very important. I think that business always tends to look strategically at short-term solutions, but eventually has to think about long-term solutions. I think it's not enough for us to react or larger crisis that we all face and that they all faced. So I think to an extent, business responded quite responsibly, but I also think that it was just associate a larger social program of trust was in the making. So I completely agree with you. I think
says the host wanted us. I am muted. Huh? No, no video, no video. No, they only asked me to unmute. Maybe because I asked a question.
Lakshmi ma'am, could you unmute yourself, please? You're back.
Yeah, okay, because I'm back. Yeah, sorry. I think what Chinmay asked was actually a very interesting question. I think we therefore need to go through a much closer examination of business responses to disaster. And I'm talking about disasters of this scale, which we actually haven't done. So I don't believe that you do not have the material. I think we have not asked the questions of the narrative that we have. So that's my position. There was another question in the chat box, but I couldn't read it because, I disconnected. So maybe that could be repeated to me, Jason.
Vrindam ma'am, that is the question by Nadir sir. Yeah,
Yes.
He's unmuted.
Okay. So Mr. Nadir Godrej, would you like to go ahead in asking the question? Yeah.
What I wrote in the chat box was one big difference now is the advent of biotechnology and the rapid development of vaccines. Isn't that
Absolutely.
a big difference from the past?
Absolutely. That's a very good spot on question. I think this is where the context specific, context is all in any kind of analysis. So one will not want to draw any facile lines of continuity between what happened then and what happened now. I think the very fact that we've had such an extraordinary degree of international collaboration to create this vaccine, which gives us some degree of hope, I think is absolutely and crucially different. I think it'll be interesting to see how business ramps up this opportunity and can come up with both profit as well as social distribution. I think that's where we will need to see how business responds to this actual realization of biotechnological intervention. That's absolutely correct. I mean, I would agree with you.
Thank you.
Jason, I think you have a question. Would you like to?
Sure. Lakshmi ma'am, good evening. So there is a link between the migrants going out specifically during a pandemic. It has happened before as well. Could you, from your study, let us know what would be, the situation of migrant children, specifically in the realm of education? Now we usually see how we have shifted into the digital age, and there is a big gap between, children of these workers, children of people who, suffer during a pandemic scenario. There is a great divide that is visible right now. Would that be seen, a divide in education specifically of the lower economic strata? Could it be visible at that point of time, specifically during earlier pandemics?
See, I think the question of vulnerability as far as the poor is concerned remains a constant feature. It may not show up. Education has been definitely much more than what it was. But the fact is that you had a vulnerable situation then and you have a vulnerable situation now. The scale is different, probably more. Initiatives are different and divides are different. But the fact is that the state of the vulnerable remains vulnerable. So the question then is, how do we responsibly think about these issues? Because we can't remain oblivious to either climate or to vulnerability. I think one thing the pandemic has told us or shown us is that we cannot afford to be indifferent to either of these issues. So I think whether it's labor or the poor or the digital divide or climate, I think we have to come together. I think this is something which is kind of critical. In 1918, but the state of the vulnerable is something which I think we all need to respond to intelligently. That's what I'm saying. There's another question on the chat box. Jason, could you read that out, please?
Sure. Are epidemics in any way watershed moments in determining consumer practices in the moment and also in posterity? Does the criterion of ability to participate in the emerging trends of consumption also produce further social distinctions? This is asked by Shantanu Sengupta.
Okay, that's a very interesting question. Never thought about it. I keep hearing about escalating consumption practice. Whenever you switch on the television, you get to hear that, okay, we are going through a terrible recession. But once everything is okay and vaccinations are back on track, we all spend, and then that, will somehow give a huge boost. Now, I think epidemics have been watershed moments in history. If you think about the plague and what happened after the plague, do happen to follow epidemics. Whether this epidemic is going to produce a shift in consumption practice, I'm not a soothsayer. But I think there's something there. I think we need to think a little bit about how economies and the psychology of economic behavior responds to a post-epidemic situation. That's a very valuable
Lakshmi ma'am, could you repeat the last statement that you made? Because I think your network connection was weak and people did not get to hear it. I've also...
I think you can also switch off the video so that bandwidth issue won't be there for a time being. Yeah.
It'll improve.
Yes.
I'll do that. I think, okay. Yeah, I actually said it was actually a very, very good reflection. I think historically we can see epidemics like plague having initiated an altogether new state of development. Think about the plague in Europe and think about what happened after that. So one can sort of assume that, or think about the Bengal famine of the 1770s, you have a completely different demographic redistribution where you have labor in a better situation and able to buy more land. So I think epidemics are watershed moments in restructuring the economy. Whether this will lead to a restructuring of consumption practices, I'm not sure. That's what we are told, that everything will go up and the world will be a happier place once we get the vaccine and the epidemic ends. Now, I don't know, I'm not a soothsayer, but I do think that there is something quite important in the way in which epidemics shape our minds, our sensibilities, and our certain economic practices in the long run? But it's a great question. It's something that I need to look at empirically. But I would agree with you saying that these are watershed movements. Think about today's pandemic and look at the race for the vaccine. Now that's a watershed moment, as Mr. Godrej told us. I mean, in terms of the biotechnological intervention, this is a unique moment. So one could then take a certain positive takeaway from it. If I was audible, that is.
Lakshmi, you also spoke about the workers and the workers' conditions during the earlier pandemic, and during this pandemic we had seen the whole migrants crisis and the way it has also affected the business. So, would you like to draw parallel? Mrs. Godrej actually was keen on understanding if we can draw parallels, with the today's situations of migrants and the earlier working conditions during the pandemic.
I think there are some surface level parallels. I think labor goes through extreme distress during moments of epidemics like in 1918 and like now. I mean, Chinmay has really documented that for us. And his recent interview, I think in the Indian Express, if I'm not mistaken, really drew effective analogies between what happened then and the way in which we've allowed or did not allow labor to find some kind of respectable and legitimate voice. So there are obvious surface parallels, but I think I'd be a bit reluctant to think about labor then of the mill variety and of the industrial sector with the kind of informal labor that suffered severely in today's pandemic. I think conditions of labor regimes have also changed. So it's very easy to come up with a very sort of easy but facile analogy between labor then and labor now. But I think the bottom line is that we do need to think more responsibly socially about any group on which our social existence is predicated. And I think this is where some business people in today's India did make very responsible statements. And I'm thinking of what a number of industrialists have done and said, the need, in fact, to make a clear distinction or the need to remember lives and livelihoods debate, and therefore come with a very strong and fairly responsible statement about unlockdown. So I think business is, in fact, uniquely positioned to create a narrative about socially responsible conditions for labor. I think if anybody is a responsible stakeholder, I think it's business. So I think it does behove on civil society and business to enter more vociferously into the debate on lives and livelihoods and not allow it to be jettisoned and appropriated by either government or by social scientists who would come with certain ideological positions. So I think if we have to be responsible stakeholders, I think business has to come up with a much stronger position. And I think some of them have. So that would be my position.
Yeah, thank you, Lakshmi.
Yeah.
I don't think there are more questions. Jason, have you received any privately or?
No, I think we
Okay.
are done for the questions.
Okay. So thank you once again, Dr. Lakshmi Subramanian, for delivering this fascinating lecture. And I think we have to learn a lot from the past, to steer the future. And I think, the business history, that's why I think becomes really important for even the future of the business. And so I would also like to thank Dr. Mukherjee, the Director General of the museum, the Board of Trustees, and the entire staff for supporting us as always and collaborating with us. We would also like to thank the Museum Society of Mumbai, the Executive Committee, and the Chairperson, Dr. Firoza Godrej, who always is an inspiration for even the team at the Godrej Archives. Special thanks to Jason, because Jason has a wonderful technical team, because coordinating the event and especially managing such webinars and online talks is you really need a great technical support for the same. So thank you, Jason and the team. And finally, thank you, audience. Without you, this wouldn't have been possible. And thank you everyone for like having this delightful conversation. So please keep following our social media, and here is the email ID of the Museum Society of Mumbai. You can check with check about their future programs. Um, and also you can also check the forthcoming events of Godrej Archives also by following our social media handles. So do follow social media handles of CSMVS as well as Godrej Archives, and keep yourself updated about our forthcoming event. And one is actually tomorrow, which will be an illustrated talk titled "The Ships of Bombay Dockyard" by Commander Ninath Fatarfikar at 5:30 p.m. on Zoom. This is organized by the Museum Society of Mumbai. So please, if you are interested and if you haven't registered yet, please do register today itself. And so see you tomorrow, and see you at our future events as well. Thank you. Thank you, everyone.
Technical team kindly come in. I think we can stop with the video recording.